What happens when privilege meets accountability? Tiffany Hamilton had always lived in a world where rules bent to her will until one fateful day, they didn't. Dragged into a courtroom and stripped of her illusions, Tiffany's journey from entitlement to empathy begins under the watchful eyes of Judge Grant. But can a life built on privilege truly change when confronted with the raw realities of those less fortunate? Stay with us as we uncover a story of justice, redemption, and the surprising power of second chances. The Los Angeles County Courthouse buzzed with quiet murmurs, the hum of anticipation filling the air as people shuffled into their seats. Sunlight streamed through the tall windows, casting long, solemn shadows across the room. A stark reminder of the gravity that often accompanied proceedings within these walls. Today, the atmosphere was heavier than usual, with every bench packed, each face eager to witness the hearing that had captured the city's attention. Tiffany Halstead, the source of the commotion, entered the courtroom in her usual fashion, late, unapologetic, and utterly oblivious to the decorum expected in such a setting. Draped in designer labels and balancing oversized sunglasses atop her impeccably coiffed blonde hair, she sauntered down the aisle as if walking a runway, her movements slow and deliberate, designed to attract attention. Her lawyer trailed behind, his face tight with unease, as though willing himself to disappear. Tiffany stopped mid-aisle, ignoring the people waiting to pass, and removed her sunglasses with a dramatic flair, casting a cursory glance around the room. Her expression, a perfect mix of boredom and disdain, seemed to suggest that the entire proceeding was beneath her. Moments later, Judge William Grant entered, his presence commanding an instant hush. In his mid-50s, with a tall, imposing frame and calm authority, he exuded respect without needing to demand it. His sharp eyes scanned the room briefly before he took his seat, adjusting his glasses with measured precision. Known for his fairness and no-nonsense demeanor, Judge Grant was a figure who tolerated no frivolity in his courtroom, a fact that would soon clash spectacularly with Tiffany's arrogant defiance. The stage was set for a confrontation of stark contrasts: entitlement against accountability, privilege against principle. The packed courtroom leaned in, the tension already palpable, as the hearing prepared to unfold. Tiffany Halstead's entrance into the courtroom was nothing short of theatrical. The oversized double doors creaked open, and there she stood, a walking symbol of privilege and entitlement. Designer heels clicked against the polished floor as she strolled in, her pace unhurried, her head held high as though she owned the place. Her lawyer, visibly flustered, hustled behind her, whispering something urgent that she ignored with a flick of her manicured hand. The courtroom, accustomed to order and decorum, fell silent as Tiffany paused mid-aisle, seemingly oblivious to the people craning their necks to catch a glimpse of her. She removed her sunglasses with a dramatic flourish, revealing a bored expression that spoke volumes. Why am I even here? Slowly, she motioned for her lawyer to step aside so she could set her designer handbag, an accessory worth more than most people's monthly rent, on the bench beside her. The whispers in the gallery grew louder, but Tiffany seemed unfazed. She finally took her seat, crossing her legs and leaning back as if the courtroom were her personal lounge. Her eyes roamed lazily over the room until they landed on Judge William Grant, who entered moments later. "All rise," the bailiff announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. The courtroom stood in unison, except for Tiffany, who hesitated before letting out a dramatic sigh and rising with a slow, exaggerated motion. Her expression screamed disdain, her body language a declaration of defiance. Judge Grant's presence, however, was an immediate counterbalance. He was tall, composed, and exuded quiet authority. His sharp eyes flicked to Tiffany briefly, taking in her posture and expression without a trace of reaction. He adjusted his glasses, opened the file before him, and began the proceedings with deliberate professionalism. "Miss Halstead," he said, his voice calm and steady, "you stand before this court today to address a series of charges, including reckless driving and endangerment of a pedestrian." Tiffany leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms as a slow smirk spread across her face. She tilted her head slightly, her blonde hair catching the light, and rolled her eyes, a small but deliberate act of defiance that did not go unnoticed. As Judge Grant continued outlining the charges, Tiffany's attitude grew more disruptive. She tapped her manicured nails loudly against the wooden table, a steady, rhythmic annoyance that drew glares from nearby court officers. Her lawyer leaned in, whispering something with a tone of urgency, but she dismissed him with a wave of her hand, muttering, "I've got this." When Judge Grant asked her to confirm her identity, her response was a casual, "Yeah, that's me," delivered with such indifference that gasps rippled through the room. Judge Grant paused for a moment, his gaze locking on Tiffany's. "Miss Halstead," he said, his tone firm but measured. "In this courtroom we adhere to a certain level of decorum. I suggest you adjust your tone accordingly." Tiffany smirked, as though the judge's words were some kind of joke. She leaned back even further in her chair, twirling a strand of hair between her fingers. "Sure thing, Your Honor," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. The courtroom fell silent, the tension thick enough to cut with a knife. Even Tiffany's lawyer buried his face in his hands, visibly mortified. But Judge Grant remained unshaken. His expression remained calm, his tone unflappable as he continued. "Miss Halstead, do you understand the charges brought against you today?" Tiffany sighed audibly, crossing her arms again. "Honestly, no," she said. "I mean, it's just some dumb parking tickets, right? And what, someone got scared because I hit the gas too hard. This is a waste of time." A collective murmur spread through the gallery. Judge Grant closed the file in front of him deliberately, removing his glasses and placing them on the bench. The room grew so silent that the faint scratching of the court reporter's pen could be heard. "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant said, his voice calm but carrying an unmistakable weight, "I would advise you to choose your words carefully from this point forward." The gravity of his tone caused even the most seasoned court spectators to sit up straighter, sensing that something significant was brewing. But Tiffany, oblivious to the storm she was inviting, shrugged nonchalantly. "What?" "It's true," she said, leaning forward. "It's not like I hurt anyone. This whole thing is ridiculous." Judge Grant remained silent for a long moment, his piercing gaze fixed on Tiffany. Her lawyer, now visibly sweating, shuffled papers nervously, casting glances between the judge and his client. "You believe this is ridiculous, Miss Halstead?" Judge Grant finally asked, his voice steady, almost conversational. Tiffany scoffed. "Yeah, I do. I mean, come on, it's not like I robbed a bank or something. This is overkill." Judge Grant nodded slowly, his calm demeanor heightening the suspense. He folded his hands on the bench and leaned forward slightly, his sharp eyes never leaving Tiffany. "I see," he said. "Let me clarify something for you, Miss Halstead." Judge Grant began recounting the details of the pedestrian incident, his tone steady but deliberate. The pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, is a 67-year-old retired teacher. He was crossing the street legally when your actions caused him to stumble and injure his wrist. He has since required medical attention and continues to experience pain. For the first time, Tiffany's smirk faltered. She glanced at her lawyer, who leaned in to whisper again, but she waved him off. "I didn't hit him," she muttered. "He's fine." "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant said, his voice now colder, "does this sound like no harm, no foul to you?" The room held its collective breath, the weight of the moment pressing down on everyone present. Even Tiffany, usually so full of bravado, shifted uncomfortably in her seat as Judge Grant's calm authority drew the courtroom into total silence. The courtroom was silent, except for the faint rustle of papers as Judge Grant flipped through the file before him. His calm, deliberate manner only heightened the tension that had built throughout the proceedings. The spectators leaned forward slightly, sensing that something significant was about to unfold. Tiffany Halstead, however, remained as dismissive as ever, her manicured nails tapping lightly against the table in a rhythmic display of defiance. "Miss Halstead," Judge Grant began, his sharp eyes locking on her, "do you recall the incident from 2 weeks ago that brought you here today?" Tiffany shrugged, her expression bored. "Some guy stepped off the curb, I honked, he moved. End of story." The judge's eyebrows lifted slightly, a faint signal of disapproval. "End of story, you say," he repeated, his tone calm, but with an edge that caused even the most inattentive spectators to sit up straighter. Judge Grant reached for a document on the bench and held it up for a moment, allowing the gravity of the moment to settle over the room. "Let the record show," he said, his voice steady, "that the pedestrian in question, Mr. Edward Lopez, is a 67-year-old retired teacher. At the time of the incident, he was crossing the street legally when Miss Halstead accelerated toward him, causing him to stumble and injure his wrist." A ripple of murmurs spread through the gallery as Judge Grant continued. "Mr. Lopez has since required medical attention and continues to experience pain as a result of the incident." Tiffany's smirk faltered slightly, but she quickly regained her composure, leaning back in her chair. "I didn't hit him," she muttered under her breath. "He's fine." "Mr. Lopez," Judge Grant said, turning his gaze toward the gallery, "would you please rise and share your account of the incident?" All eyes shifted as Edward Lopez, a slight man with salt and pepper hair and a sling on his left arm, slowly stood. His movements were careful, deliberate, as though the weight of the moment pressed heavily upon him. He looked directly at Tiffany, his expression one of quiet dignity rather than anger. "I was walking to the grocery store that morning," Lopez began, his voice steady but soft, "when I saw her car speeding toward the crosswalk. I froze for a moment, unsure if she would stop. She didn't. I had to jump back to avoid being hit, and that's when I stumbled and fell." The courtroom was utterly silent as Lopez continued. "I don't remember hearing an apology. All I remember is the sound of her horn and the way she sped off like none of it mattered." Lopez paused, his gaze softening slightly as he addressed Tiffany directly. "Miss Halstead," he said, "do you remember me?" Tiffany frowned, her brows knitting together in confusion. "No," she replied bluntly. "Should I?" Lopez offered a faint smile, tinged with sadness. "I was your fifth-grade teacher." The revelation hit the room like a lightning bolt. Gasps rippled through the gallery, and even Judge Grant leaned back slightly, his expression shifting to one of intrigue. "You were one of the brightest students I ever taught," Lopez continued. "I remember how you used to volunteer to help classmates who were struggling. You once stayed after school to help a boy with a broken arm finish his science project. You had so much potential, so much kindness." Tiffany's face went pale. She opened her mouth to speak but closed it again, her usual bravado suddenly absent. Lopez's voice grew steadier as he spoke. "That's why this incident hurt me more than just physically. The girl I remember would never have dismissed another person's pain as ridiculous." He gestured to his arm in the sling. "It's not just about the injury, Miss Halstead. It's about the message your actions send that some people's lives, their safety, don't matter as much as your convenience." Tiffany shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her gaze dropping to the table in front of her. For the first time, the weight of her actions seemed to press down on her. Judge Grant allowed the silence to linger before he spoke. "Miss Halstead," he said, his tone even but firm, "it seems this incident is more than a matter of traffic violations. It's about accountability and the choices we make when we think no one is watching." Tiffany raised her head, her usual defiance replaced by a flicker of something else, perhaps shame, perhaps the beginnings of understanding. Lopez returned to his seat, his quiet dignity leaving an indelible mark on the room. The gallery, which had been murmuring moments ago, was now utterly still. Even Tiffany's lawyer, who had spent most of the hearing fidgeting nervously, sat motionless. For the remainder of the session, Tiffany was uncharacteristically quiet. Her sharp remarks and eye rolls ceased, replaced by a subdued demeanor that hinted at an internal struggle. The personal connection with Lopez, combined with his dignified testimony, had pierced the armor of entitlement she wore so confidently. Judge Grant's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than necessary before he resumed the proceedings. "We will now move to sentencing," he said, his voice as steady as ever, but everyone in the room knew that something had shifted. Tiffany Halstead was no longer just a defendant, she was a person forced to confront the impact of her actions in a way she hadn't anticipated. The courtroom was silent, every eye fixed on Judge Grant as he shuffled the papers before him. The weight of the case seemed to permeate the air, pressing down on everyone present. Tiffany Hamilton, perched on the edge of her chair, exuded an air of defiance, though her clenched fists betrayed a sliver of unease. Across the room, her legal team exchanged nervous glances. Judge Grant finally looked up, his expression impassive, but his eyes carrying a depth of understanding that commanded attention. His reputation for fairness was well known, but so was his penchant for crafting sentences that went beyond punishment, delving into the roots of human behavior. He began, his voice steady and deliberate. "Miss Hamilton, your actions have been laid bare for this court, a deliberate disregard for others, fueled by an unshakable belief that your privilege places you above the law. In this, you have not only broken rules but displayed a profound lack of empathy, a condition I believe warrants remedy as much as it does punishment." Tiffany shifted in her seat, her bravado slipping for a moment. "With all due respect, Your Honor, I don't see how this is necessary. I've already apologized for." Judge Grant's gavel struck wood, cutting her off. "Ms. Hamilton, this is not a negotiation. This court does not operate on your timeline or at your convenience. Sit down." The murmurs in the gallery swelled briefly before quieting under his glare. Tiffany sat back, her cheeks flushed, but she avoided his gaze. "Privilege," Judge Grant continued, his voice ringing out, "is not inherently wrong. Many are born into circumstances they did not choose, and with those come advantages. But when privilege blinds one to the struggles of others, when it becomes a shield to avoid accountability, it turns corrosive. both for the individual and for society. He leaned forward slightly, his tone softening but gaining a sharper edge. Your actions, the manipulation, the arrogance are symptoms of a deeper issue, a lack of understanding of what life is like for those who do not share your station. It is this court's belief that true justice in this case lies not only in punitive measures but in an opportunity for growth. Ms. Hamilton will be the heart of your sentence. Tiffany's lips parted, confusion crossing her face. Opportunity for growth, she repeated, her tone laced with incredulity. Judge Grant ignored her interruption. This court sentences you to 1,000 hours of community service at the Bright Horizons Women's Shelter. There, you will assist women and children fleeing circumstances of abuse, poverty, and neglect. You will listen to their stories and understand the struggles they face daily. Additionally, you will complete a certified sensitivity training program designed to challenge your assumptions and teach you the value of empathy. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Tiffany shot to her feet. This is ridiculous. I'm not some criminal who needs reforming. You can't make me do this. Judge Grant raised a hand, calm but unyielding. Ms. Hamilton, you will sit down, or you will be held in contempt. She froze, staring at him with wide eyes before sinking back into her seat. Her jaw was tight, her face pale with anger. Judge Grant's gaze softened as he addressed her directly. Ms. Hamilton, I understand this is not the outcome you expected. It is, however, the one you need. The privilege you have wielded so carelessly can be a powerful tool when paired with understanding and responsibility. It is my hope that this sentence will be a step toward becoming the person you have the capacity to be, rather than the one you have chosen to become. Tiffany stared at him, her defiance wavering. You really think this will change anything? She muttered, more to herself than the room. Judge Grant leaned back, his tone even but firm. That is up to you. Growth is not guaranteed. It requires effort, reflection, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. Whether you embrace this opportunity or squander it is your decision. But make no mistake, Ms. Hamilton, this court has ensured that you will face it. As his words settled over the room, the atmosphere shifted. The tension of confrontation gave way to a contemplative silence. The gallery seemed to collectively hold its breath, grappling with the weight of the judge's verdict. Tiffany's lawyer whispered urgently in her ear, but she seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the table before her. For the first time, the facade of entitlement appeared to crack, revealing a flicker of uncertainty beneath. Judge Grant gathered his papers, signaling the end of his pronouncement. Court is adjourned, he declared, his gavel striking with finality. As the courtroom began to empty, Tiffany remained seated, her expression unreadable. The noise of shuffling feet and murmured conversations faded into the background as she stared ahead, the gravity of her sentence beginning to settle. From the gallery, a young woman who had testified against Tiffany watched with quiet satisfaction. She turned to leave, a sense of closure washing over her. Meanwhile, Judge Grant exited the bench, his own expression tinged with a mixture of stern resolve and quiet hope. In that moment, the weight of the justice system had done more than punish, it had offered a path to transformation, leaving Tiffany standing at a crossroads, her future uncertain, but no longer without direction. The fluorescent lights of the Bright Horizons Women's Shelter buzzed softly as Tiffany Hamilton leaned against a mop, her polished nails a stark contrast to the utilitarian cleaning tools in her hands. The shelter's coordinator, a no-nonsense woman named Maria, had left her with clear instructions: mop the common room, and when you're done, help sort the donations in the back. Tiffany had rolled her eyes at first, muttering under her breath about menial labor. But as the hours wore on, something unexpected began to shift. She paused for a moment, watching a young boy in the corner play with a set of worn building blocks. His laughter, despite the frayed cuffs on his sweater, rang out with a purity that caught her off guard. His mother, seated nearby, was gently untangling a second-hand scarf. She noticed Tiffany's gaze and offered a tentative smile. "First day?" the woman asked, her voice kind but cautious. Tiffany nodded, unsure how to respond. She hesitated before asking, "How long have you been here?" 3 months, the woman replied, her fingers deftly working the scarf's knotted threads. "It's been hard, but we're safe now. That's what matters." Tiffany opened her mouth to say something, an apology perhaps, or a platitude, but the words felt hollow. Instead, she simply nodded again and returned to her work, the boy's laughter echoing in her ears. Weeks passed, and with them, the rough edges of Tiffany's resistance began to wear down. Each morning she arrived at the shelter, her designer bag replaced with a plain tote, her meticulously styled hair pulled into a simple ponytail. At first, she had avoided interacting with the residents, sticking to tasks that kept her at a distance. But over time, their stories began to seep through the walls she had built. There was Janine, a former nurse who had fled an abusive marriage, and Elia, a teenager who had been abandoned by her family. They spoke with Tiffany not as a symbol of privilege, but as a fellow human being, sharing moments of heartbreak and resilience. Tiffany found herself listening not out of obligation, but because their words began to resonate in ways she couldn't ignore. One afternoon, while helping a mother organize donated baby clothes, Tiffany noticed a tattered copy of a book she had loved as a child. She picked it up, running her fingers over its creased spine. "You can take it," the woman offered. "I don't think anyone here would mind." Tiffany hesitated. "No, I think it's better here. For someone else." The woman smiled, and in that small moment, Tiffany felt a pang of something unfamiliar yet profound humility. Judge Grant's words still lingered in her mind. Growth requires effort, reflection, and the willingness to face uncomfortable truths. At the time, she had dismissed them as sanctimonious, but now, they felt like a map she had only just begun to read. One evening, as the shelter prepared for a fundraiser, Tiffany volunteered to speak. Standing at the podium, she scanned the room filled with shelter residents, staff, and community members and took a deep breath. "When I first came here, I thought this was a punishment," she began, her voice steady but vulnerable. "I thought I was here to serve a sentence, to pay for my mistakes and move on. But I was wrong. The truth is, I needed to be here. I needed to see what I've been blind to for so long." She looked out at Maria, at Janine, at the boy with the building blocks who waved at her with unabashed joy. "You've all taught me that privilege isn't about what you have, it's about what you choose to do with it. And I've been selfish. But I don't want to be that person anymore." The room erupted in applause, but Tiffany barely heard it. For the first time in her life, her words felt real. Months later, as Tiffany's hours at the shelter came to an end, Judge Grant reviewed her progress report. The detailed account from Maria described a woman transformed, not perfect, but aware, humbled, and willing to do the work to grow. During a brief meeting in his chambers, Judge Grant addressed her one last time. "Ms. Hamilton, the person who stood in my courtroom months ago and the person sitting before me now are not the same. You've taken the first steps toward becoming someone capable of using privilege for good. That is the essence of redemption, not erasing the past, but building a future worthy of it." Tiffany's eyes glistened, though she blinked quickly, refusing to let the tears fall. "Thank you, Your Honor, for the chance." Judge Grant's lips curved into a rare smile. "Thank yourself, Ms. Hamilton. Change is never imposed, it is chosen." As Tiffany left his chambers, she felt lighter, though not because her sentence was complete. For the first time, she carried something far more valuable than the trappings of wealth: a purpose, shaped not by entitlement but by empathy. And for the first time, she understood what it meant to truly give. Tiffany Hamilton sat on a bench outside the Bright Horizons Women's Shelter, watching the first hints of dawn break over the horizon. The chill in the air felt sharper than usual, but she didn't mind. She wrapped her coat tighter around her shoulders and stared at the shelter's entrance, where a few residents were already stirring. Her reflection in the glass door caught her eye, a simpler version of herself, hair pulled back, face free of the layers of makeup that once felt like armor. She hardly recognized the woman staring back, and for the first time, that didn't scare her. She pulled out her phone, something she'd used sparingly in the last few months. As her finger hovered over the social media app, she hesitated. Then, instead of scrolling, she opened the notes section. "Privilege doesn't define who you are, it defines what you have the power to do. I've learned that it's not about guilt or shame but responsibility. And every day I'll try to do better with what I've been given." Satisfied, she saved the words and pocketed her phone. Judge Grant's words came back to her as she stood to leave. "Redemption is not a destination, Ms. Hamilton. It is a journey, a commitment to change, one decision at a time." She had hated him for those words at the time, dismissing them as patronizing. Now they felt like a mantra, a reminder that there was no finish line to cross, only steps to take. Tiffany Hamilton thought she had it all figured out until life taught her a lesson no wealth could buy. Her journey from privilege to purpose reminds us that change is never easy, but always possible. Now, it's your turn to reflect. How will you use what you have to make a difference? Share your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and join us for more stories that challenge, inspire, and empower. Because real change starts with you.